Where in the world did I put it? I know it has to be around here somewhere. Joy, do you know where I put my camera? Come on, it's gotta be here somewhere. Freaking saw it the other day. There you guys are. Getting a little dusty there. Haven't seen you guys in a while. Hold on. This has been a long time coming. I know it's been a while, and there's a little bit of a reason. That reason is right here. The S2000 finally got a new home, baby! But before we get into that, I do need to go ahead and rewind a little bit. We got a little bit of catching up to do. It's been, you know, a few months. So let's go ahead and actually go back to before the S2000 got here. And let's see what we did. I know it's been a few months, but if you recall, we pretty much overhauled a vast majority of the engine, pretty much everything other than the short block itself. We put in new springs, retainers, push rods, a cam, oil pan, almost the whole 9 yards. Well, in today's episode, we're going to go ahead and we're going to be throwing that engine in the engine bay, and we're going to be working on the mounts, transmission mount, and we're even going to mount up the hood so we can maybe start working on tubing that front end a little bit. So without further ado, let's start working on the frame rails. I'm going to be cleaning up where we cut away the bent part of the frame rails quite a bit. My plan is to go back and cap these off, so I'm trying to square them up as much as possible so that way I can plate them and cap them. Next, we're going to be cleaning up the leftover parts of the horizontal tube that connected the stock frame rails on the S2000. This part was pretty big and took up a lot of space, so I do plan to go back and replace it with a regular, just steel DOM tube, but I'm not worried about that right now. We just want to get the car set up and running. So next thing you'll see me doing is cleaning up a little bit of the front end of the frame rail itself. And then after that, we're going to be moving on to stitch welding the engine bay before we put the engine in, just because it's going to be taking up some space. So I went ahead and used some Scotch-Brite carb cleaner to clean up some of the areas that we're going to be stitch welding. And then I used my super clean sprayable bottle to clean it even more before finally marking it for welding. And what I did here was I marked it every other inch, and I marked each weld spot an inch long. So that way it should look pretty uniform, and it should be very structural. As you can see here, I somehow forgot to film myself actually doing the welding, but this is what they look like. I got pretty good penetration on the frame rail, so I'm very happy with it. Here we're also going to be cutting off the flange from the exhaust headers. This is so that way I can throw them on the engine while it's in the car and start figuring out my exhaust routing. I do plan to run the factory headers. They should be more than sufficient. Next, we're going to be putting the engine into the engine bay and testing how the bell housing fits up against the firewall. Ultimately, I found that I will need to clearance the firewall a little bit so that way I can get my hands to remove the bolts if I need to while the engine is still in the car. This is in preparation for if I were to go through a clutch or something during an event. This is very common in drifting, so I'm trying to make this car as serviceable as possible, because at the end of the day when we're at the track, I want to be able to do anything and everything we need to do. Next, I was pretty happy with where I was able to fit the engine, and I got some pretty good ideas on how much of the motor mounts that I needed to cut away in order to put them where I want them. And like I said, I'm going to be welding these motor mounts to the frame, so I went ahead and trimmed them up, got them up against the frame, and started welding them. Here you will see me actually welding them. I didn't weld them all the way through just yet, just in case I did need to cut them back out. I didn't want to have to put any excess material that I needed to, but I made sure it was still beefy enough that it was going to support the weight of the engine without issue. Hey guys, what is going on? Welcome back. I wanted to go ahead and give you guys a quick update. We actually got the engine all the way in the car, pretty much almost completely done. So I wanted to go ahead and show you where we're at here. I did go ahead and get the mounts mostly tack welded in place. They're not really the best looking as of now, but I went ahead and got some good solid beads on there just to hold it in place. I am going to go back. I'm going to drop the subframe eventually. We're going to weld all the way through on the underside on both sides, and then this thing shouldn't be going anywhere. I am slightly concerned about when I have to remove the engine and transmission, how in the way these might get. Since these are going to be fully fixed to the frame itself, I could see these potentially getting in the way of the bell housing. I guess we'll find out. Worst case, if I have to, I'll cut these off. I'll build a plate here that we can then bolt these to, and then you would be able just to remove them by unbolting them from here. But for now, we're going to go ahead and run with this. We need to actually kind of get the car moving. So this is at least determining where the final place of the engine is going. These turned out so much better than I thought they would. I was really kind of just trying to get the engine thrown in here because we need to actually get the S2000 moved soon, and I wanted to move the engine and transmission all together with the car just because it'd be easier overall rather than trying to move it separately. So I went ahead and rushed to kind of get the mounts in, but I am unbelievably impressed with how well it fits in here and how almost perfectly squared off it is. I started taking measurements from here to here on both sides, and I literally have this thing squared off in the chassis about as best as I can get it. You can kind of see where the front crank bolt lines up. It is lined up perfectly with the center section of the subframe. So this thing's kind of right in its final resting spot. Over here behind the engine, there's still plenty of room to get your hands down there and get to the bellows housing bolts, which is something I wanted to keep. I was considering maybe moving the engine even further back, but I actually like where it sits. It should be pretty well serviceable. The shifter mount is pretty much almost in the factory location. It's just forward maybe an inch or half an inch, but it's really not bad at all. It's actually fitting really well. There's one small spot that I found that's down here that I will need to clearance a little bit in order to make room for the transmission to properly sit all the way, but it's almost there. It's really nothing at all. I'll just hit it a couple times with a hammer. We'll clearance it just fine. Right now I'm working on the transmission mount. I went ahead and grabbed some spare metal that I had lying around, and I'm bending it up, drilling holes, getting that in. But other than that, we do have the frame rail stitch welded, as you can see here. That's pretty much done. I am going to go through and try and do the rest of the chassis at some point as well. But overall, I'm really happy with how this thing sits. Let's get back to work and finish up that transmission mount. Moving on to that transmission mount. As you can see here, I thought about starting with a thicker piece of steel, but I figured it was going to be a little bit too hard to bend. I ultimately settled on what I believe is 3/16 steel that I just had lying around that you can pick up at your local hardware store. I went ahead and marked it up how wide I wanted it and cut it up with, at first, the cutting wheel and then the jigsaw because it went so much faster. After doing that, I needed to go ahead and get it bent, and I hope this is a little bit of inspiration for you guys that don't have necessarily any kind of a metal brake or anything to bend metal easily. I simply just clamped it to my welding table and then used another C-clamp to put on some pieces of wood to then help give some leverage to push the metal and bend it. And still I had to bend a little bit of it by hand, but I was actually really happy with how these bends came out, and I got pretty lucky because I didn't ultimately measure where these bends needed to go. I kind of eyeballed it a little bit and just winged it. Like I said, I really just needed this transmission mount in the car, so that way it was supporting it for whenever we went to go move the car to its new location. I went ahead and grinded off some of these sharp edges here with flat disc, and then I started test fitting it. This was mostly to make sure I got the bends where I wanted them, to see if I needed to bend it anymore, and then also to start drilling the holes for the bolt holes themselves. I also kind of just winged this and eyeballed it, and this first hole I ultimately drilled, I needed to go back and re-drill. No big deal though, like I said, this is really going to be a prototype piece, but in all honesty, with how good this ended up coming out, I may not actually go back and rebuild it for a little while. This should be able to handle up to the loads that it's going to be experiencing, and I shouldn't really have any major issues with it. So here I actually found an area where I needed to clearance it to not rub up directly against the transmission itself. And later on I found that I actually had some extra spots I needed to clearance. As you can see here, as I'm trying to line up the bolt holes on the other side of the transmission, I noticed that it was hitting another particular spot, so I ended up just having to grind that spot away, which is what you see here right now. Now we're moving on to the final fitment, and somehow I apologize, I missed filming the area where I bent the other side of the bracket, but I went ahead and got it bent up where I wanted it. I got 2 holes drilled, one on each side, so that way I can mount it up. And then here you can see I cut up these extra pieces so that way I could triangulate it and add a little extra support to it. I noticed that when the weight of the transmission was going down on the mount, it tended to want to flex just a little bit, so I added those extra pieces in there to help triangulate it some, and from there it actually became very stiff. The hole in the center I left so that way I can go back and put a dimple die in there and dimple it out. That should add a lot more stiffness to this bracket, and I think it'll suffice for all the loads it's going to be handling. Next, we're moving on to the hood. I wanted to go ahead and throw the hood on there because, like I said, I do plan to make a tubed front end for the car, and we essentially need the hood to know where the factory latch position is going to be. I'm just going to go ahead and use that for now. It should be more than capable, but I do also have some racing style hood hinges or hood posts that I will eventually put onto the Cybon carbon fiber hood. One major advantage of the S2000, even if you're using a stock hood, is the stock hood is made of aluminum and they're also very light like this carbon fiber one is. But I got a very good deal on this Cybon carbon hood, and it actually has the looks that I was going for this car, so I decided to go ahead and pick it up. It was also a local deal, so there was no reason to turn it down. Alrighty guys, here it is. We finally got a lot of work done on the S2000 and I'm extremely happy with the progress we made. We got the engine, transmission, and even the hood kind of mounted on there. It's starting to look more and more like an S2000 again. The engine fits wonderfully. I'm extremely happy with it. As you guys saw, we made a custom transmission mount. I apologize that my camera died and I didn't film as much as I wanted to, but it came out okay. That mount is really meant to be more of a prototype version. I want to ultimately go back and actually design one in CAD and then actually have it made out via laser cutting, and then we'll weld it together from that. But for now, we actually just need to get the car moved here soon. So we went ahead and just knocked out that one transmission mount because I needed the engine and transmission in the car, so it'd be a lot easier to move it all together. But I'm really happy with how this hood came out. Let me show you what I did here a little bit too. There's a very typical S2000 mod that a lot of people do, and for those of you that don't know, let me show you what it is real quick. So if anybody is at a car show and you ever see an S2000 hood open up this much, it's because they simply cut the tabs on the hood mount itself. And I'm sorry, not the hood mount, the hood hinges. There's a little tab there that's supposed to interfere with this little piece of metal. And if you cut that tab or just grind the tab away a little bit, you can actually open the hood hinge a lot more. And that's extremely useful at track days, because if you're ever trying to work on your engine and you really just need to get in there and dig deep, it's nice to have the hood out of the way without having to pull the hood off. Now, there are new hinges that have come out before that make removing the hood a lot easier and actually almost a toolless process. But this is a really easy and free mod to do. So I went ahead and just knocked this out. I am gonna make some kind of stopper or mount to at least hold it so it doesn't come falling down whenever we're at the track. But overall, I'm extremely happy with it. Look how well this engine fits, guys. I mean, it's honestly hard to say how good of a fit this is. We've got plenty of room to be able to get to the transmission, bell housing bolts, tons of room to be able to work on everything. And then two, I know some people might have been worried about hood clearance with the intake, but it looks like when we get underneath it, it looks like we actually get a lot of room to spare. As you can see, there's quite a decent cavity there. I am going to be running an LS1 intake, and I am running some spacers to adapt the new Gen 5 blocks to the older Gen 3 intakes. So it might raise the intake up a little bit. Worst case, we might be taking that little crossbar out just to clearance it, but I think that's the most we'd have to do. It looks like, honestly, this engine was almost made for the S2000. It's kind of ridiculous to say, but we got the transmission and engine mounts fully in the car now. The engine is supporting itself. We no longer need to have it on any kind of a stand or hoist. I am so excited to finish working on this thing. Next thing we got to do is actually start working on some wheel dollies so we can move the whole chassis a little bit easier to its new destination. That's going to be the next episode, but overall, I hope you guys really enjoyed today's episode. It was a blast working on this thing. I'm really excited to get deeper and deeper into this build, and I think you guys are going to like what we're going to be doing. So make sure to subscribe, like, comment anything you'd like to about this build. Got any questions, feel free just to put them down in the video below. But until next time, I'll see you guys then.